Hi, I'm your indie fantasy author, Melinda Kucsera, and in this short little episode, I wanted to do something fun and cool. So, Joshua Blum, who was on a couple of, maybe it was last month, it was the episode entitled Fantasy Lore and More Empty Hands. He is also a podcaster, so I went on his show and we had a whole long conversation. That was a lot of fun, and he edited out a section of that with his with an intro introducing his podcast, and he sent it to me. So I want to play that for you, and yeah, I think it's really cool. I've never gotten to do a promo for another podcast, so for me, this is really fun and exciting, and I hope you enjoy this. I hope you enjoy listening to what Joshua has to say. So take it away.
Hello, Fantasy Lore and More listeners. You may be wondering, who is this guy talking and what happened to Melinda? Well, don't worry. Melinda will be right back in a second. My name is Joshua Blum. I'm the host of the 13th Hour podcast. It's a show I've been doing for about 10 years or so. It's talking about some of the influences behind my own writing. And I'm a fantasy writer just like Melinda. And we got to talking, and it's really always cool to be able to connect with somebody else who does the same things. I just don't meet very many people like that in day-to-day life. And, you know, we both do podcasts. We both write from multiple points of view. We've been creating these fantasy worlds since childhood and, you know, looking for ways to kind of share them with other people. I think both of us would probably write regardless of whether anybody actually read what we wrote, because the stories just continue to come. And as we both talked about in our own shows, I mean, after a while, the characters kind of take on a life of their own. We're going to be talking about a little clip in which this may resonate for any of you who are writers yourselves. When you've been working for quite a while on something, how do you know when it's actually done? And how do you go about proofreading your work and gaining some distance from it when you're so connected to it? So I think that's an interesting discussion, a quandary we all deal with. I know one of the things that I did is that, and that's how I created my podcast, and I really had no intention of creating a podcast because I didn't really entirely know what it was at that time. This was back in 2014 when it was not quite as mainstream as it is now. I just ended up recording a draft of my book, The 13th Hour, as a way of proofreading it. It eventually became the first 15 episodes of my show, and then it eventually morphed into exploring influences behind like some of the things I had written that made their way into those books. 80s movies from the early 90s, things like The Rocketeer, The Last Starfighter, Labyrinth, Neverending Story, teen movies, and then eventually looking into things that made their way into like the creation of the music that I've written and toys and games and stuff like that. They're all been connected to the books that I've written because it all, obviously, we don't create stuff out of a vacuum. And it's always nice to be able to kind of trace back to where those things came from. So you can find more information about my show on 13thr.wordpress.com or look up the 13th Hour on wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I'm going to turn it over to the discussion that Melinda and I had. Hey, thanks for letting me pop in here.
I have an app on my phone called @Voice. It's a free plugin, and it will read your document to you. So I've had this app for years. So when I'm not sure about the ending of the book, I will load it on there. I will go for a walk, and if the walk, usually the walk is not long enough to hear the whole book. So then I will clean the house and cook things. Like I will just keep busy, go do shopping and listen to the whole thing. And as I'm listening, I will pay attention to, because when you're listening to a book, you can hear 10,000 words in an hour easily.
Right.
You know, even if you have it set on like the slowest possible like recitation speed, you could still get about 9,000, 10,000 words in an hour. Yeah. And if you listen a bit faster than that, because you can get more words, but don't listen faster than you can understand. The goal is that you want the audio to be reading back your words at a speed that you can follow, like at like either at conversation speed or a little below, and you can hear I talk pretty fast. So I probably have it set a little faster than most people, but for me, it's understandable. Yeah. And you want to just pay attention to not the little details. Obviously, if you see something wrong, if you're using like a cloud-based editor for your words, you can pull it up and fix a typo right then and there, which is great. Yeah. But the point of it is not for that, but do fix them if you come across them, because why leave them for later? Don't make that a future self problem. And you can listen to the broad strokes and you can pay attention to, okay, what was the character's actual goal? Did they meet the goal, or did the goal change? Because sometimes they can't achieve what they wanted, or they realize that, okay, what I thought I wanted isn't really what I wanted, so my goal changed. And did they meet that? Did we solve the problem? Because the beginning of the book makes a promise. And if you write in multiple point of view, like which I do, which I think is where authors kind of struggle to figure out where does it end. Because if you're writing multiple points of view, they all have goals. Right, did they meet them all? There's challenges that are coming up for them. Did they surpass them? Did they have, so you can just make yourself a little like overall checklist of like, what was their goal? Did it change? What's their new goal? Like, what's logical for the character for them to feel like it's the end? And did we solve the original problem? Like, if they went to save the timeline, was it saved? If it wasn't, you're not done. Then you need to sit down and figure out, like, okay, what do we need to do to save this in the least amount of chapters possible? And you can. And what will logically get us to a point where this problem is resolved? And then the book is done. So I went back through book 2 because I had that problem. I'm like, where do we end this thing?
Right.
And I had to figure, because there's 4 main points of view. So I had to figure out, and what is the big problem? And there were 2 problems. Okay, so we've got to solve both of them, or bring them to a point of that feels conclusive, even if it's not. Because if it's a trilogy, there's the overarching problem, which you don't solve to the very end, but there's other problems that come up along the way that in the solving of that bigger one, and you have to make sure that you solve that in each book. That is like non-negotiable. You have to solve that book's problem. Yeah. So that's what I went through, and I just made sure, and then for each person, for each point of view, what's the logical end for them? And I figured that out, and it was like, okay, I only need 2 more chapters for this book because there's 2 points of view that I didn't bring to a conclusion. So, and then I ended up having to write 3 chapters because one of the points of view, some characters from another point of view, like ended up arriving in the middle of what this one was doing, and they needed that other person to help them to solve the problem from the beginning of the book. So I'm like, okay, we need an extra chapter to allow for this, and I ended up ending it in 3 chapters, and I was like, yay.
I really like that. There was something you said there. I'm going to have to go back and rewind it during the editing process, but it was something like, and maybe you can paraphrase it. Something like the start of the book is a promise or something.
Yes. Yes. If you read enough books, you'll realize every book, it may not be the first chapter, but every book makes a promise. There's a thing there's a story the book is offering to tell you. There's a problem the main character needs to solve. And really good books, everybody has a problem they need to solve. And by the end of the book, everybody's problem is solved. There may be some overarching thing which they may discover during this and be like, okay, well, we know there's this bigger thing, but we can't do anything about that right now because we have this other thing in front of us that we have to solve, which is the problem in that book. And and that's how you have a satisfying read, is whatever you promised at the beginning, you close out at the end.
Right. Yeah. Well,
in some way.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I really like that. You should have it engraved.
Yeah. When you read a lot of books, you start to especially listening to audiobooks, because you're listening to large chunks of a story at one time. But you listen for 2 hours, you could listen to a third of a book. Right. It becomes that much easier to understand its structure, because it's not this. I think speed readers also get that that perspective too, because you're getting more of the story at one time.
I think that's a really good idea. The whole idea of listening to what you've written afterwards, not just reading it, but listening to it. I mean, that's certainly how this podcast came to be. That's exactly for that reason, is to read it out, wow. Listen to it. If that's what the first 15 episodes are. Things will sound differently to you as a reader or reading out loud than they might if you're just, reading it silently. I think so. I think absolutely.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for having me on your show and for sending me this segment. I think was just such a fun time. And I hope you'll check out his podcast, The 13th Hour. I'll have all the information in the description or the show notes. And he's got a lot of great stuff. I was on episode 451, so there's a whole lot of episodes to listen to. And as he said in his segment, he's been doing this for 10 years. So there's lots of audio content for any of you out there who are looking for something to dig into. And I will be back in the next episode with another fantasy author and another fantasy book. So see you then. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, all the things so that you're notified when the next episode drops. Have a great day or great night wherever you are.